I made Aliyah from Paris 40 years ago, teaching at Ilan University, and I did my best to retain my French accent all these years. I'd like to thank very much Professor Rosenfeld for this invitation. Thank you, Edwin. You certainly heard about the huge controversy on collective memory which took place in Israel in the latter half of the 1980s and the 1990s. Over more than a decade, a great number of books were published by Israeli academics, which generated heated debates in Israeli and Anglo-Saxon media. This book, to mention only a few, included The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem by Benny Morris, The Birth of Israel, Myths and Realities by Simcha Flapan, Collusion Across the Jordan by Avi Schleim, The Seventh Million by Tom Segev, etc., etc. All of them challenged the Israeli entrenched beliefs regarding the history of the Jewish people, the Zionist movement, the Jewish settlement in Eretz Israel, Israelis and the Shoah, and the Israeli War of Independence. In our 5 Israeli universities, a new school of young historians, some of them defining themselves as Zionist, others as post-Zionist, expounded views that were mostly influenced by postmodernism. All of them questioned the basic assumptions of our official Israeli history as taught in our schools and universities. Benny Morris, who was 40 years old at that time and had a PhD from Cambridge, called this group he belonged to the New Historians of Israel, an explicit reference to the French Nouvelle Histoire, which had carried out a radical reappraisal of traditional methods in history. These Israeli scholars said that the major historians of the first generation, like Gershom Scholem, Yitzhak Baer, Ben Zion Dinu, and others, had presented an ideological history of the Jewish people and of Israel, as they were in fact mobilized in support of the nation-building process, and more specifically in support of the dominant Zionist socialist movement, Mapai. They asserted that these great historians had always wanted to prove that a Jewish nation had existed long before Zionism, and that the Jewish aspiration to return to statehood had always existed, thus portraying the Jews as a unified people who, throughout the diaspora, had maintained a cohesiveness across time and space and was constantly focused on its return to Eretz Israel. In other words, they wanted, consciously or unconsciously, political Zionism to appear as the perfect continuation of the whole Jewish history. And another thing, the new historians also said that Israel's official history had presented the 1948 war as a tale of good and idealist Jewish soldiers fighting bad and cruel Arab terrorists, while the reality had been quite different. This huge controversy in Israel spread quickly to all the social sciences in Israel, which at the time were strongly influenced by American sociology. The old Israeli sociology, mainly represented by the Eisenstadt School at the Hebrew University, was fiercely accused by a number of professors, including Yonatan Shapiro, Sami Samucha, Baor Kimmerling, and others, of placing itself at the service of the Ashkenazic establishment, and by harping on the success of the so-called melting pot, of trying to hide the exploitation of oppressed minorities in Israel, especially Israeli Arabs, Oriental Jews, and women. My question today is a difficult one. To what extent have the writings of the Israeli new historians and sociologists opened the gates and offered the ground to the wave of anti-Zionism and delegitimization of the State of Israel? To what extent have these works been used to delegitimize not only Israeli policies, but the Jewish state itself? In short, where do we draw the line between criticism, however scathing it may be, and delegitimization? I would like to answer this question by putting forward my own theory. My thesis is that in recent years, semantic shift has been the anti-Zionism essential tool in the transition from criticism to delegitimization. Semantic shift is the conscious and voluntary twisting of qualification of certain events to the point that the new qualification is a total falsification of the reality. In the specific case of Israel, the semantic shift to the expressions of ethnic cleansing, apartheid, racism, or fascism occurs through widening or metaphoring. The first field of study examined by the new historians was the history of the Jewish people in relation to modern Zionism. What they questioned was the theological vision of the old historians of the Hebrew University who gave past events a determinist meaning, linking them to an inevitable destiny that was to be accomplished by the state. Another bedrock of this official history was Jewish exceptionalism. The survival of the Jewish people, they said, had been systematically presented as a unique case in human history. It had led to a methodological academic opposition to any comparison of Israel and of Jews in general with other people. Another critic bears on the constant search for Jewish roots in Eretz Israel by historians who set out to prove that the Jews had formed the majority of the indigenous population, had lived in that land continuously, and therefore had an historical right to possess it. The scholar who undoubtedly was most strongly criticized was Ben-Zion Dinu, a distinguished professor of Jewish history and a prominent member of Ben-Gurion's Mapai. He was a member of the Knesset and Minister of Education at the beginning of the 50s and was one of the founders and president of Yad Vashem. In his book, he constantly stressed the perfect unity of the Jewish people and its unique historical continuity. The new historians also criticized the state's exploitation of the great Jewish history myth once they had been nationalized and secularized. The exodus from Egypt, Hanukkah and the revolt of the Maccabim, the story of the siege of Masada, and the great Bar Kokhba revolt presented at the first Zionist national revolution, etc., etc. The new historians believed that the official history taught in Israel had a pernicious effect. Silence about the exile experience was leading to rejection of the diaspora instead of its acceptance as a positive phenomenon. Hiding the exile experience, they said, prevented Israelis from empathizing with other refugees throughout the world and from showing greater openness to other social groups, whether they were Asian or African refugees, Oriental Jews, or Palestinian Arabs. However, this legitimate process of re-evaluation of so many important aspects or events of Jewish history together with the repeated accusation of exploitation and distortion leveled against the establishment, has gradually opened the door to a global and total reappraisal, which calls into question the whole history of the Jewish people and, in fact, its very existence. Here, we have an excellent example of semantic shift by widening. The new historians had confined their criticism to the erroneous use of certain very specific episodes in the history of the Jewish people. But then, some people began to use the magic word invention. Historians and sociologists who held that the Jewish people was an invention gleefully rushed through the door opened by the new historians. They began to say that not only episodes of Jewish history had been distorted, but that the whole Jewish history was a fabrication, which means that the Jewish people itself does not exist. If it is so, the Zionist narrative and the arguments for Israel's right to exist collapse like a house of cards. We can easily see the link between the work of the new historians, whatever their degree of intellectual honesty, and Tel Aviv professor Shlomo Zand's trilogy, The Invention of the Jewish People, The Invention of the Land of Israel, and How I Stopped Being a Jew. These books, especially the first one on the invention of the Jewish people by Zionism, became incredible bestsellers, especially in Europe, and particularly in France, among leading intellectuals, some of whom are now on the side of delegitimization of Israel and BDS. I would add that for many of these European intellectuals, French intellectuals, the theory that the Jewish people is a pure invention is a very comforting one. Because if the Jewish people does not exist, how could anti-Semitism exist? Can there be hatred of a people that does not exist? A similar contention was raised by the new historians about the history of Zionism, as the new historians contested the Zionist figure of the male Ashkenazi socialist pioneer. Was he really a socialist, a simple man who hated violence and had taken up arms only in self-defense against Arab terrorist gangs? In the writings of the Israeli new historians and sociologists, we read that the pioneer movement had nationalistic or militaristic features, and that the fathers of socialist Zionism, as our colleague Sternel asserts, were in fact nationalists and not at all socialists. Or as Uri Ben Eliezer from Tel Aviv states, far from being immune from militarism, Jews in pre-state Palestine, particularly the Sabra, were fascinated by military force, and most often their ethos was not a defensive but an offensive one. And here again, on the basis of the new historians' claims, and by a process of semantic widening, Zionism as a whole comes to be defined as a militaristic, racist, and colonialist ideology, or even as a form of Nazism, as we see, for example, in England, with all these placards equating the Star of David with the swastika, which are stapled at every pro-Palestinian rally. The third field of inquiry concerned the attitude of the Jewish community of Palestine during the Shoah. The debate centered mainly around The Seventh Million, this best-selling book published in 1991 by the Haaretz journalist then, Tom Segev. In Segev's view, the Israelis who had remained passive during the Shoah are the 7th million. The book presented a very unflattering image of Israeli leaders, especially Ben-Gurion. The author contended that they did nothing during the Shoah and tried to use it to further statehood interests, Segev was severely critical of the inadequacy of rescue efforts, the very poor welcome given to survivors after the war, and the exploitation of the Shoah, not only to obtain more war reparations from Germany, but also, he said, to demonize the Arabs as being the new Nazis. Let us say right away that all leading Shoah historians condemned this book for having significantly distorted reality. Although Segev defines himself as a proud Jew and a Zionist, there is a unifying thread running from his 7th Million to Norman Finkelstein's The Holocaust Industry, and perhaps even beyond that to Shoah deniers. I will just mention as an example the famous French Shoah denier, Roger Garaudy, who is in his famous negationist pamphlet, The Founding Myth of Modern Israel, quotes verbatim passages from Moshe Zimmerman, the main professor of German studies at the Hebrew University and a very highly controversial critical historian. Most importantly, the Israeli new historians contributed to change the perception of the 1948 war, which was then unanimously regarded in Israel as a clean and heroic war. They revealed that the massive exodus of the Palestinians during the war had been caused by Jewish violence. Benny Morris first of all, but also others like Uri Bar Yosef, of course Abi Schlein, and others denied the official history of the Palestinian tragedy. They accused those they called mobilized historians, such as Nathanael Loch or Elchanan Oren, of having willingly imposed self-censorship in addressing uncomfortable questions raised by the war. Far from being clear, Morris said, the 1948 war had been a dirty war on both sides, during which numerous acts of atrocity were committed. These books were deeply shocking for the men of the Palmach 1948 generation, because they replaced the sufferings of the Jews by those of the Palestinian Arabs, and replaced a story of Jewish heroism with acts of brutality that could metaphorically evoke Nazi atrocities. Of course, these views on a subject as sensitive as the Palestinian exodus were not readily accepted in Israel, and these assertions were contradicted by leading Israeli historians who totally challenged the new historians' narrative of the war. By the way, this narrative is today the main argument used against Israel by anti-Zionists, asserting that a state which deliberately expelled indigenous population in order to take its place has no legitimacy at all. But Shabtai Tevet, Ben-Gurion's biographer, had a ferocious polemic with Benny Morris, as did Elchanan Oren, who proved that the order to evacuate the Arab inhabitants of Loder and Ramleh was given in response to Arab extreme violence, while my colleague at Bar-Ilan, Ephraim Karsh, simply accused the new historians of falsifying the archive. It is easy to see how the writings of the new historians, though I believe they cannot be held fully responsible for that, have served to delegitimize Israel. When Plantu, a cartoonist, the main cartoonist at Le Monde, the major French daily, published a front-page drawing of a Nazi soldier pointing a weapon into the back of a Jew, who is pointing a weapon into the back of an Arab, he was promoting the view that both represent exactly the same kind of violence. The semantic shift by means of widening and metaphoring from random and sporadic acts of violence to ethnic cleansing and then to Nazism was thus completed. Anti-Zionist writers such as Ilan Pape, Noureddin Masalha, or Rosemary Esber promoted the use of the term ethnic cleansing to qualify these events. The semantic shift means, in fact, three things. First, that these acts of brutality were not at all sporadic acts, but a total cleaning, a full-blown expulsion. Second, that these acts were part of a full Jewish plan to rid Palestine of its inhabitants and take their place. Lastly, it suggests that it was a racist plan targeting an ethnic group. Another example of this kind of metaphorical semantic shift can be found today when criticism of the steps taken to separate Israelis from Palestinians in the territories, like bypass roads, security fence, roadblocks, or checkpoints, uses the term apartheid to describe these measures. Obviously, this qualification and the reference to racial segregation in South Africa leads to an immediate and total delegitimization of Israel. To be just, we must not forget that the most staunchly Zionist, like Professor Benny Morris himself, who apparently changed his mind and teaches today in an ironic way at Ben Gurion University, have not hesitated to condemn publicly the use that anti-Zionists like Finkelstein, Masalha, Pape, or others have made of their writings. Let me conclude. Semantic shift or semantic change occurs when disturbing events in a nation's history, and I don't need to tell you here that there are very disturbing events in every nation's history, are consciously and purposely included under a general heading which automatically generates delegitimization, such as the expressions ethnic cleansing, colonialism, apartheid, war crimes, genocide, racism, Nazism, fascism, etc. Why? Because these terms are not only qualifications. They suggest four things. First, that these acts were in fact part of a systematic policy. Second, that they were part of a detailed plan right from the outset. Third, that this plan was based on an ideology. Fourth, that lastly, that these disturbing events in a nation's history are, as Plante's cartoon illustrates very well, not different from similar perverse acts committed somewhere else in the world. As such, they need to be condemned in exactly the same way. To sum up, as you could understand, my thesis is that it is precisely such a semantic shift or semantic manipulation that distinguishes the discourse of the Zionist patriotic left in Israel, to which I belong, from the discourse of the anti-Zionist and other BDS promoters. Thank you.